let's pick up the show here. What happens to your children when you leave them at school or even at crèche for the day? And are you confident they're being handled with the same care that they would at home? Well, Times Live receiving a video from a source of a caregiver, and in it the child can be seen being kicked on the floor. This is for a dirty nappy. The disturbing footage also reveals the abuses hurled at the child, and of course this particular incident raising questions about how the conduct of those who we entrust with the safety of our children affects their overall development, and the signs that parents need to look out for in the event that their children are being victimized and being abused when they are at school. Well, my guest tonight is early childhood development specialist Eric Atmore. Eric, good evening and thanks for your time tonight. I suppose we can never get over the pure shock of seeing visuals such as what has emerged today, but certainly the research, when we look at the state of our early childhood development centers, does not really instill confidence in the fact that those that the majority of parents are entrusting their children with would in fact not violate that trust and would live up to the policy that that they would in fact take the best care of these children.
Kathy, good evening. Good evening to your viewers. What happened in Gauteng these past few weeks is shocking. It's absolutely outrageous. It should never happen, and it should never happen in a situation where a young child is placed in the care of an adult. That perpetrator and the owner of that early childhood center, they must now face the law. They must face the full wrath of the law, and when they are found guilty, they must be sent to prison, and that key must be thrown away. We cannot have our young children who have got a basic human right to be protected and to be watched over. We cannot have them abused under any circumstances. So yes, it is shocking.
How much data do we have of what actually goes on at early childhood development centers?
Kathy, the sad reality is that there is no data on the incidence of child abuse, child neglect at early childhood development centers. It's very, very difficult to pick up, and cases like this mostly only come to light when they are filmed or when there's an admission of guilt. But it is something which is very, very difficult to pick up. And unfortunately, the provincial government social development departments who are charged with protecting those children, watching over them, they do not keep those sorts of statistics. Now, part of the reason is that the compliance requirements for a good quality early childhood center are very seldom adhered to. The provincial social development departments don't have the staff and they don't have the expertise to do the monitoring visits which the Children's Act requires. So if you were to ask me how prevalent is this, nobody in South Africa can tell you with any accuracy, and that's a sad state of affairs.
And of course, Eric, it points to a bigger problem, rather, which has been just the approach that the country has towards early childhood development centers, you know, and especially the kind of expectations that are placed on those who are minding the children at the time. Of course, you know, you're taking your child there to be taken care of, but also expecting that they receive some kind of education that's going to aid their development. Now, often these are not resources that are available to many of the ECD centers.
Yes, you know, we have about 30,000 early childhood centers, ECD centers across the country. And every morning, about 80,000, mostly women, but also some men, care for our children. Now, probably half of those 30,000 centers, probably half to two-thirds, are not registered. And what that means is that they don't meet the minimum compliance requirements of the Children's Act. Now, the reasons for that are multiple, but widespread poverty, historical neglect of early childhood development, and lack of political will. These are all factors which bring about the situation where our preschool children, those who are pre-grade R and pre-grade 1 really are neglected and not cared for the way they should be in a normal democratic society which respects young children's rights.
And Eric, perhaps bring it home for us again why it is so important that young children receive a particular kind of training, or as informal as it may be, at that early stage in their childhood. You know, that it's not just about, you know, leaving your child with a neighbor, but that there is something that can be gotten out of that time that will feed into the kind of human being they will be going forward and aid their development throughout their life.
Historically, we've been told that preschool is preparation for formal school. That's changing, and preschool is now being seen as of value in itself. So that child, as a human being, as a citizen in a democracy, that child has certain basic rights. Remember, South Africa signed the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. So a child who has all the early learning opportunities does perform better academically. That child is less likely to need remedial education. That child is more likely to pass through school without failing. That child is more likely to get a job as an adult. And an interesting phenomenon which was found in a major study in America is that a young girl child who has a quality preschool program is less likely to become pregnant whilst a teenager. Now, these are all huge social, economic and educational value to society and to communities. So the days of asking, is preschool important, are over. And unfortunately, in South Africa, we don't give the attention to the young child that we do to higher education, to tertiary education, and to high school and primary school.
And certainly, perhaps that points to the numbers where you see also the level of abuse that just takes place involving young children. But I want us to take this conversation a bit further now. For parents, what are the markers of a good early childhood development center? What should one keep in mind when they're looking for a facility that can take care of their children?
Kathy, as you put it there are two markers. The first marker is the physical infrastructure. Is the building that the children are in, is it clean? Is it safe? Is there sufficient play space for the children? Are there sufficient toilets and hand wash basins? Is there a safety fence around the facility? Those are all the infrastructure requirements, and the compliance with that is relatively strict. Before an early childhood development center can get registered, it has to meet all those compliances. In addition to that, there has to be a learning program, an accredited learning program which teachers and children follow. The teachers need to be trained, but not only in their formal educational training, but their approach to young children, how they handle young children, their own maturity. And by maturity, I don't necessarily mean age. Are they able to handle a child who is perhaps having a difficult day, a child who's had a sleepless night, a child who's not feeling too well? I think in many cases, children who are abused in these early childhood centers, there may be something niggling in the child's not feeling too well, and the adult caregiver thinks that the child is being rude or disrespectful or ill-disciplined. So the adult caregiver needs to be able to tell that this child today needs a certain way of being worked with. And tomorrow that same child may be jumping up the monkey poles, maybe walking through the trees, jumping off the trees. So every child has to be treated as an individual in that learning environment. And those adult caregivers have to have the maturity and the approach to learning which is conducive to learning, rather than that very, very strict disciplinarian approach of you do what I say, and if not, you'll go to the corner, you'll get a smack, you'll be punished. And it eventually plays itself out in what we saw in that video clip in Gauteng.
Eric, how much more complex does it become when we are dealing with children who are living with disability? How much more training needs to go into those individuals who are specifically in charge then of taking care of those children?
Children with special learning needs do need to be treated with a certain amount of individuality. But whether a child is disabled or not, no child should ever, ever, ever be subject to abuse by an adult caregiver. Yes, the caregiver's training needs to be perhaps more in depth and to take into account the various disabilities. But whether a child is fully able-bodied or whether the child is disabled, every single child has the same basic human rights, basic child rights. And no child anywhere in the world deserves to be treated the way that child was in Johannesburg.
Is it necessary for those who are taking care of these children to receive formal training? Because, you know, especially in communities, we'll see this a lot, where a trusted parent in that area then becomes almost the central point where everybody else takes their children, and you have, you know, the formation of an informal center, an informal crèche developing there. So is it important that the person who's taking care of the children receives formal training?
Yes, surely it is. There are training courses at the technical and vocational education training institutions. There are training courses at the non-profits. But the sad reality again is that perhaps 50%, half of those 80,000 people that I mentioned who work with children every day, probably half have had no training. And that's because our training output or our training throughput each year is abysmally low. So yes, you need training. There will be instances where a mother or a young person in the community will substitute teach for a day or two, and that's quite permissible. That happens in the best of schools. But one of the requirements of the Children's Act, the chapter on early childhood development, is that the teachers must be trained to an equivalent of level 4, which in the old terminology is grade 12. That training helps shape attitudes and behaviors as well. And most often, it's not the technical part of working with young children which is the problem. It's the attitude and the approach of the adult. There has to be a loving, caring environment for every single child, every single day. And that is perhaps the most important criteria, in addition to the formal training on the learning program, on room arrangement, on music and movement, and on all the activities that take place in an early childhood development center.
All right, Eric, just before I let you go, what interventions then need to be put into place once an incident like this has taken place, especially for the child now who has suffered at the hands of this teacher? What needs to happen for them to recover?
I think at an absolute minimum, the Provincial Department of Social Development has to send social workers and therapists out to the school to work with that child, but also other children. You know, we don't know from that incident if this was an isolated case or if it had been happening systematically. Perhaps the other children were also being abused, and the abuse is not always the hitting with a satchel as we saw. It's not always overt. It's the little pinching. It's the talking harshly, speaking harshly to a young child. So all these things, I think immediately that child, the family need some form of counseling from the Provincial Social Development Department. But I think what you've done is perhaps the time has come for a register to be kept of incidents like this. You know, there is a police check, so that before you're employed to work in an early childhood development center, the Children's Act requires a police clearance certificate. But what happens once the adult caregiver is in that learning environment? I think some form of register of these incidents, and you've certainly given me something to think about on this.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. That was Early Childhood Development Specialist Eric Atmore. Thanks for your time on Tonight with Jane Dutton.